podcast by the Windsor-Essex Children's Aid Society. My name is Tina Gatt, Manager of Community Outreach, and my co-host.
I'm Mike Clark, Manager of Public Relations and Fund Development for the Windsor-Essex Children's Aid Society as well.
The Windsor-Essex Children's Aid Society has been on a meaningful journey to enhance and grow our collective cultural competence by integrating equity, diversity, and inclusion into all that we do and to all of the services we provide. We are excited to announce a new team that will help us to advance this important work. We are joined today by Hugo Vega, who is our new Director of Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion, and Dorcas Yaboa, our new One Vision, One Voice Specialist.
Thank you.
Welcome.
Thank you.
Welcome.
So Hugo, tell us a bit about yourself and how you came to be our new Director of EDI.
Sure. Well, first of all, thanks for having me. This is a pleasure to be here. So I guess my journey was not one that was very intentional around equity and diversity as a pointed sort of position. I think it's an emerging field. It's an emerging focus for organizations, rightfully, I think, organizations and institutions. For me, my work really started with working with migrant workers in Leamington. So in our region, we're very fortunate to have migrant workers, and they've contributed immensely to our society. I was providing social and cultural opportunities for migrant workers for about a year through an OTF-funded organization. And then I made a transition to working with newcomers about 10 years ago. So not realizing that the work of working with migrant workers and marginalized populations, same with newcomers, is essentially equity work at its heart. So I just now started to look at that work through that lens. But for 10 years, it was just figuring out how we can support immigrants in Windsor-Essex through a variety of means, helping them navigate systems of education, healthcare, legal systems, and really just making sure that they had good opportunities to be successful. And unfortunately, they're underrepresented in a lot of positive outcomes in society. So it was really around figuring out how we could advocate for change from a system level. So I think the systemic approach to solutions is what became a bit of a passion for me. So I think that's how I kind of just dove in. And over the years, I managed teams and projects, some local, some national in scope, and just have been able to, I think, contribute to that work. So again, essentially realizing that it was about bettering their outcomes. So I guess at the heart it was always work of equity and diversity and inclusion. And just recently been able to join the WCAS team here, and really pointed around understanding how to address some of the overrepresentation of marginalized communities. So this is work that I've become very passionate about. I think it ties into a bit of my journey as a newcomer. I came to Windsor when I was 10, and like many families, struggled for a few years as a family. So I think it just drives me I think there's that connection and that understanding of what it means to go through things that are out of your hands sometimes, and being able to better those outcomes for people. So.
Right. Great. Thank you. We're happy to have you.
Thank you.
Dorcas, shortly we will have you explain more about the One Vision, One Voice. But first, if you can tell us a little bit about yourself and how you came to be our new One Vision, One Voice specialist. And again, as well as with Hugo, we're very excited to have you in this role and feel that you're definitely the right person to fill those shoes.
Thank you, Mike. Thank you for Tina for inviting me. I'm very excited to be here. And my journey was a long one, and I guess I will just put it in context of when I came to Canada. So I was born and raised in Ghana in West Africa, and I immigrated to Canada when I was 18. But just prior to immigrating to Canada, I had started university, and I always had in my mind that I wanted to be a lawyer. But then I took one course in social work, and I knew that was what I was meant to do. And so that summer break, I got a volunteer job with World Vision, and we were going, and this was in Africa, and so we were doing needs assessment and just going out in different areas. And so my passion to do what I do, working with families and working with children, essentially started. there. And then when I moved to Canada, through my education, my placement, I ended up CAS. And it was just kind of with the same spirit and the same understanding of improving outcomes for families that we serve and children. So I worked almost 11 years in frontline as a family services worker. But my passion really is working with all families, but my passion is like working with Black families and making sure that I can support them with my knowledge, my expertise. And so I have been involved in One Vision, One Voice, and I know we're going to talk about that a little later. But as part of WCAS's journey to equity and diversity, when this position opened up, I knew that, you know what, I really want to do this. And so I feel really privileged and honored out of all the people that applied to have been the successful candidates. And I'm just excited to see how this journey unfolds. Yeah, so.
Wonderful. We're happy to have you as well.
Yeah.
And there's another important member of your team, Charlotte LaFranc, and Charlotte's really been instrumental in bringing our organization to where it's at and being part of your team. So do you want to talk a bit about Charlotte's role with the organization and on the team?
Yes, so we'll maybe take this one on together. I have known Charlotte for a lot of years. So Charlotte has been one of the faces of CAS in the community. Tina, Mike, you're also both very recognizable. I've known of you for many years. Because of the work in the community. So Charlotte is to me, I think, has been a great ambassador for CAS.
Absolutely.
She works immensely well with community partners. She builds partnerships. She's on committees. She's advocating for the work that you do. She's trying to bring a cultural lens to the work that WCAS is doing and has been doing that for a long time. I think, from what I know and from what I've been hearing, now that I get to work with her more directly, I think she's been very critical to laying a really strong foundation over the last several years. And as I mentioned earlier, there is, a rightful focus on this type of work, with organizations, institutions, and governments. But that is a very long journey, and I think she's been laying that foundation for a long time with others. But I think it's been a big champion internally to understand that it is a journey that we have to look at the culture, we have to look at the policies, we have to look at the structures, the mandates, the funding. There's so many aspects of this, and I think she really recognizes that. And she's a very relationally driven person, so she understands that bringing people along in the community, like the Islamic community, the Black community, the Indigenous community, is really important, and trust building is key in that. So I think she's been doing a lot of these different pieces. She's kind of, I think, a bit of a floater in all these areas. And I know she's grateful to have a bit of a team as well now joining that work. So it's not all on her shoulders. Although I know there's a lot of other champions here, but I think she's just been key in that role. So we're happy to have her continue that, and then we're happy to come in and support in that. And so a lot of this is more the historical perspective that I know of some of the stuff she's done, but I know Dorcas has actually worked with her for a number of years.
So Charlotte and I go way back. I actually, just like what Hugo said, my first time meeting Charlotte was when I was doing my placement at W5, and she came to give a presentation on Children's Aid and what Children's Aid does. And so even like over the years working with her at WCAS and in the community, she is such a strong ally of all marginalized groups, and she is very engaging. She is just amazing at what she does. But she has been such a strong champion for WCAS. And then also with issues of equity, diversity, and inclusion, her being the chair of our internal diversity committee over the years and anti-oppression, I have seen her and I've worked with her, and as the society continues to evolve in our journey of equity and diversity. So she's definitely, she's an amazing woman. I could go on and on and on, and I think Hugo really captured it all. So I don't want to repeat everything that he already said, but she's phenomenal.
And I think a couple of takeaways from that is it's really about not one person moving this work forward, particularly in our organization, but also about not just community, but about relationships.
Absolutely.
We can't do this work without really having relationships. It's not show up for a meeting leave and think that you've established a connection. So she really has done that work, and you both have in your own right done that work. And again, we really look forward to see where we go as an organization.
Wonderful.
Yeah, and I guess that leads into a question for you, Hugo. You and I have talked about this a little bit on the side, that the type of work that you folks do and you're going to be moving forward with, there's just so much. And I guess when you look at that, the whole work of equity, diversity, and inclusion, what makes it challenging, and how can you go forward to confront what you want to do in order to achieve the goals at hand?
Yeah, so that is a very big question, and it is a complicated one. I think at the heart of this work is justice work, and I am not a social worker in background, but I know that social work is grounded in that idea of justice. So how do we look at society and bring a lens of justice and try to change that, support individuals directly, families, but also look at structural and systemic changes to that. So I think that's the challenge, is that it's all encompassing. You're looking at the entire system, not just as an organization, but everything around you. You're looking at the intersecting systems that we work with, policing, education, and others. So it becomes really difficult to kind of understand that it's not this isolated thing that can just happen on its own. It has to interact with everybody. And then there's the reality of the relational component. It's not just relationships with the people we're serving. It's not just with the communities that they're a part of. It's also internally, right? We want to be able to journey together as colleagues, as friends, doing this work, to understand how we're interacting with each other and how that all helps the work. But ultimately, it is about bringing justice. And with child welfare, again, not my background historically, but quickly understanding the disproportionality of Black, African, Caribbean families, of Indigenous communities, and of LGBTQ plus communities. So that's a big focus, a very pointed focus for the work that we're going to do, or we are doing, and I know the journey's been ongoing with WECAS, and there's been a lot of really great work done so far. That I think, in my mind, in my short time here, I see us in a really good trajectory. And this isn't a criticism of others, but I see a lot of other organizations and institutions that aren't quite as far along as WECAS is. So I think perspective is really important with this work. I think we're in the right track. I think there's a long way to go, but I think we should at least recognize that there's a good trajectory in this work. But it's ongoing. It's not going to be a generational change. It's going to be a long-term historical change. So will this work be accomplished in 20, 30 years? Unfortunately, probably not, because again, it's that big. But are we in the right direction, in the right trajectory? I think we are. I think I mentioned this before. It really is about that culture too, and it is about the individuals, the collective journeys that people have. I know I'm still on a journey. I by no means consider myself an expert, and I'm still catching things that I'm learning or doing wrong or need to better for myself. And that's me, who's intentionally trying to focus and learn and understand these concepts. So as an organization, it becomes really hard when 300 plus employees are all on 300 plus different journeys and trajectories. So how do we begin to create a common movement? Is part of the work. And then we have the pressures of, again, legislation, funding, policies, processes that become difficult. So that's the challenge. It's not a well-defined, let's write a policy on how to do this very finite thing. It's how do you pull all the strings that are all connected to this. So quite challenging. But again, we're facilitating, I think I would say, as a team. This is the work of everybody, and I think that's something that's embraced here.
Well, and I started this by saying our work in EDI is a journey, but I know that you often refer to that real collective story, and you just alluded to that. Can you unpack that a little bit more for us? What do you mean by a collective story?
Yeah, so I've started in the last few weeks as I've been kind of trying to understand how to bring the theoretical and practical together with and recognizing and honoring the work that's been done. I'm starting to see it in different ways. So I think, like I said, as individuals, we're all on a journey. As an organization, we have now 300 plus people on their own journeys. The organization itself and the sector itself is also on a journey, right, with equity. And that is also to the backdrop of society and history. So when we talk about things like anti-Black racism, decolonizing organizations or institutions, you have to recognize, we're all of the things that brought those things to be. So, historically, since settlers landed in the Americas, that started and that has had ripple effects until now. So it's all of these layers that there's an individual work that needs to be done, organizational work that needs to be done in the context of a society that's changing, and we're interacting with police and schools and court systems in the context of a much broader historical context where slavery was real, where colonialism and imperialism were real. And so complex that we can't see it as this really finite, here's a starting point, here's an end. I think it's a journey of individuals, organizations in the context of a much larger historical journey. So I think when we begin to, in my mind, begin to at least understand that context, we begin to understand that, yeah, this isn't going to change overnight. It's impossible because of the complexity, but we're part of this longer journey. And I think, again, as an organization, I think we're doing some really great stuff. Long way to go, but great trajectory. And I think it helps ease some of the fears and tensions that we have to do things 100% right away, or that we're going to be punitive in how we correct, to become more equitable. And I think if we see it as a journey, we allow for space for learning and growing and making mistakes and being able to have mentor and teaching moments, and then growing together rather than saying, like, if we're not there by the end of this operational plan, then we failed. I think it changes the tone of how we see the work.
Mm-hmm. Sure.
And you've touched on that with us as an organization, and I think the society has just adopted a new strategic plan. And of course, all of this, equity, diversity, inclusion, is a huge part of that. And I think, identifying that from both the operational level and as an organization really puts out the word that we're very serious about this. Mm-hmm. And like you said, all of our employees are on a journey. Everybody's different, but at least as an umbrella for our organization, we're seeing this as a priority for moving forward. So, yeah. So I think it's exciting times ahead to see how it all unfolds, both personally and from an organizational perspective.
Agreed.
Yes, for sure.
Agreed.
Dorcas.
Yes.
So anyhow, now we're getting back to One Vision, One Voice, and really exciting stuff. And if you can tell us a little bit about it, when did it start? And
Absolutely. So One Vision, One Voice, before even One Vision, One Voice started as an initiative, it goes back, I think, in 2012 and again in 2016, the United Nations Committee for Child Welfare and Child Wellbeing around the world did alert Canada in saying that they were noticing a lot of overrepresentation of Indigenous and Black youth in the child welfare system as a whole in Canada. And in 2016, one of their reports really asked child welfare agencies to look into the causes of this overrepresentation and what was causing the disparities. And so in 2015, Ontario, OACS funded the phase 1 of the One Vision, One Voice project. And that really essentially was to host, listening sessions all across Ontario. So they reached out to the African community and they gathered qualitative data and quantitative as well, just to understand the level of the disparity and disproportionality. And around the same time, there was a lot of media attention also to the same issue, right? There was a lot of things going on in the media. And Dr. Kuya Benjamin, a professor at Ryerson, had coined the term anti-Black racism. And so all that factors working together led to the first report, which was the phase 1 of One Vision, One Voice. And it had data which really, I guess, was very alarming to Ontario OACSs across the board, because people started paying attention to the disparities and they started disaggregating the data just to understand what had happened. And so phase one of it really was a report on where we were at. And then out of that, they made some recommendations. They made recommendations to child welfare and to all the other system, education, police, and all that. And I want to say child welfare really took it and started running with it. And so that was the phase two of the project, which was a self-assessment of the different agencies to see where things were at, and which WCAS did participate as well. And it's interesting to see how across the different agencies in Ontario, like what Hugo said, that every agency is on a different journey. And in some areas, WCAS is doing really great, and in some areas we're also behind. But the great thing is that we're on that trajectory and we're committed and we're really willing to do it. And so it's been going on for, I'll say about 6-7 years now. And there are different programs that are being rolled out. And so really One Vision, One Voice is targeted in the gist of disrupting and dismantling anti-Black racism so that it can lead to more equitable outcomes for the Black families, the children, and the youth that are involved in the child welfare system. So in a nutshell, that's really what One Vision, One Voice is, yeah.
And so what will be your specific role as OVOV specialist here at the agency?
Yes, thanks, Tina. So what the One Vision, One Voice specialist role is essentially is coordinating the implementation of the race and equity practices, the recommendations that came out from the OVOV report. And so each agency is encouraged to have an OVOV program specialist just to help coordinate the implementation. And so there were 11 race and equity practices recommendations that were made. But OVOV itself has a framework which OACS encourages all the different CASs to adopt when working with marginalized populations, but specifically with Black populations. And so my role is to coordinate with all the different departments, because the work of race and equity and all that really is an organizational work. So it's not just one specific department, but working with the team, like we already talked about Charlotte with Hugo, and in the different departments to ensure that equity is reflected in everything that we're doing. And so that really is what this OVOV specialist is tasked with. Yeah.
So I
you.
guess, just to add to that, so
Yes.
what are we doing well with EDI, equity, diversity, inclusion, and what would you say, Dorcas, might be our immediate needs to focus on?
We're doing, as I said earlier, we did a self-assessment, and there were a lot of areas that we were doing well. One of the, to put it in context, one of the race equity practices is to commit to courageous leadership, to have those leaders who are courageous enough to broach the topic of racism in the workplace and to champion equity work. And if we look at that alone, we can see that WCAS is really doing an amazing job. We're having those conversations. We're creating those spaces. We're making sure that our trainings are intentional to address all those issues. We have a diversity team which is tasked to implementing OV and OV. So if you look at that, we're really way ahead of some of the CASs who don't even have, they're still in the process of starting to talk about OVOV. In the issue, or not the issue, but in the matter of collecting data and disaggregating that data, we are really doing a great job. I can see how we've improved over the years as to where there were no conversations of even making sure that the data was accurate in the system. And now, the data is getting more and more accurate. Frontline workers are being supported and encouraged to get that information. And engaging. So all these things I'm mentioning are all part of the race and equity practices, right? Engaging the community and talking about how they're being impacted by the agency. And these are things that we're already doing. We continue to do it. We have the strategic plan that we've been working on. And so there are a lot of areas that we're doing well. There are other areas where we're starting to come along. One of the recommendations is how do we bring along the other systems like the education system or the police system, because they definitely interact with us a lot. A lot of our referrals come from these systems. And so part of our work is to ensure that we're not just going on the journey, but we're bringing them all along. And so in that respect, I see that we're in the beginning stages, but we're definitely not shying away from it, and recognizing that it's, as Hugo said, it's a journey. And so even though WCAS is on this trajectory, it might not be the same for the other systems that we interact with. And so understanding that, but also not being more intentional in our efforts to engage them in those conversations and to point areas where we see inequity or areas where we see disproportionality, and how those agencies or systems are perpetuating that, and not being afraid to have those dialogues. So I could go on and on, as you can see, but I say that, like Hugo said, it's a journey, and I think that WCAS is very committed to this journey and to put the agency on that trajectory, and that's what I really appreciate about where we are at right now. Yeah.
And Hugo, you spoke earlier about the overrepresentation of Black and Indigenous children and youth in foster care, in our care, receiving services from children's aid societies. And so, Dorcas, from your perspective, I mean, even though there's this urgent call to action to address this issue that continues, you were a frontline worker for 10 plus years. So from your perspective, how did we get here? Why are we seeing this continue today?
That's such a big question. And I think that we have to recognize, just as Hugo was saying earlier, that there's so many things at play. Like, we have to look at the history of it, and colonization and the interaction that child welfare has had with Indigenous communities. And even though some of those practices are not necessarily operating on the surface, there is that legacy that has been passed on from generation to generation to generation. And so a lot of the issues are more structural and systemic. And so that plays not even just at the local level, but on a provincial scale, on a national scale. And one of the things I always, as a frontline worker, I always say that we all have the same eligibility spectrum. We all have the same tools. We're all given the same tools to work with, but that is very subjective. The interpretation of those tools are very subjective. And so depending on how the tools are being interpreted, depending on the person's individual conscious, unconscious biases, all that comes into play when we're making decisions, when we're working with families in the community. And so those are things that I always want us to be mindful of, that the decisions that we're making, we have to make sure that we center it in cultural safety, because our values are not all the same. And so we can see how the legacy of colonization, slavery, and all those things have been passed on from generation to generation, and sometimes in different quantities or details, right? And so that has impacted child welfare, not just child welfare from the school. Like, a person calling who is working with an Indigenous family or an Indigenous Black youth in the school may have concerns that may not necessarily be valid, but really being influenced by that person's biases. Right. And that person would transmit that in their referral. And then when we get it, we also take that on. We have our own personal biases and we're investigating. And so a lot of times, knowing that most of the families, most of the workers, the staff, don't come from that culture, don't have that understanding, it has led to a lot of disparity. And I think that the great thing is that we've recognized that one of the important pieces, there's an overrepresentation of Black, Indigenous youth, but then there's also an underrepresentation of the staff that actually deal with these situations. And so it has taken us many years to get here. We recognize that this is where we are, but we're committed to ensure that whatever we pass on to the next generation is much better than what we have received, right? So.
Great, thank you.
I think we could talk forever,
Yes.
and unfortunately we're running out of time, but a very quick question for you, Dorcas. What is the role, what is the BACC, and what is their role?
So the BACC is really the acronym for Black, African, Canadian, Caribbean. And I want to honor the work that went into coining that term, because Black people are not a homogeneous group. There's a lot of diversity in the Black group. And I think that to be able to represent the intersectionality of identities, we coined that term BACC for it to be as inclusive as possible. And so the BACC really is referred to Black community, whether it's the families that we're serving or internally the Black staff that are here. We have the internal BACC committee and we have the external BACC community, the external BACC advisory group. So when you hear the term BACC, it is really an acronym for Black, African, Canadian, Caribbean families or community. That's
you.
essentially
Great,
what that
thanks.
is.
So as we close out, is there anything else that we may not have chatted about that you wanted to quickly note, your hope for your positions, anything that you would like to leave us with?
Maybe two quick things for me, and one of them Dorcas has alluded to. Though I'm now part of the team, I still kind of think I'm bringing an outside eye to things, and there's so many things that are being done well and so many people that are involved, but I have to commend current leadership here, because unfortunately one of the colonial legacies is the concentration of authority and power and wealth in general, and this is how structures work, right? Is a concentration, and not every culture is like that. It tends to be a colonial approach. So unfortunately, leadership is really important in any organization, any company, any structure. And if that leadership isn't valuing and moving along equity work, usually the organization, no matter how many people in that organization want that, it just won't get traction, unfortunately. So leadership here, I think, is amazing in embracing that, and is really sharing in that power and in that role to be able to bring about equity. And I just want to say thanks to all of the frontline workers who I know have been journeying through the pandemic, are trying to be on their own equity journey, are processing probably their own ups and downs of life, just like all of us. Home kids in virtual school, and the changes of restrictions and everything else. I think it's been a really stressful time for everybody, and it's been really hard. And I know equity can sometimes seem like another heavy-handed thing to just push on frontline staff, but I hope it's embraced as that journey, and that there will be room to grow and learn and adapt, and that we're doing this together and that we can rely on that. But I think it's been, I have a big heart for people that work on the front lines in any organization, and I think it's important to always recognize them and their work and contributions. So.
That's great, thank you.
Final words?
I think that Hugo said most of what I want to say. So what I really want to center this is that equity is, the journey is for all of us. So OVOV is not just for the equity team or leadership, but it's for all of us. And we as an agency have enormous power in the community. And so it is important that we all do some reflection and be more aware of our biases and how that can impact the families that we serve. It is our responsibility. I feel like we owe it to the families that we serve to use the power that we have to improve their lives and not to leave them worse than we encountered them. So that's kind of what I always want people to have at the back of their mind. How can we improve people's lives and not make things actually worse for them? Yeah.
Absolutely. Powerful closing comments, but really it's a beginning for all of us. So this is great. Thank you.
Thank you both.
Thank
Yeah,
you.
again, thank you for sharing what is certainly a timely topic for all of us personally, for society, for everybody really at this point in time. And, you know, it's encouraging to hear these words and to hear that we are moving forward. So thank you. Hopefully we can have you both back another time because this is just an evolving conversation, and I think there'll be so much more to talk about even in the weeks, months, and the years to come. So
Right.
anyhow, thank you both, and thank you everyone.